It was meant to be a solution, a grand gesture to cauterize a festering national wound. Instead, it became an indictment, a final damning verdict on the entire political class. In a sterile conference room under humming fluorescent lights, the words that shattered the carefully constructed peace came not from a politician, but from a survivor. A young woman named Ellie sat before the press, the flashes of cameras reflecting in her eyes, and delivered a judgment from which there could be no appeal. We were stripped from our voices, she said, her own voice steady, devoid of the trembling emotion the government's media handlers had expected and hoped to manage. That inquiry, it was rigged from the start. It was corrupt. In the silent, stunned moment that followed, a government strategy, months in the making, turned to dust. The attempt to control a narrative had failed catastrophically. The truth, raw and unmanaged, was now loose, and it was hunting its authors. The unraveling began nearly 5 months earlier, with a promise made under the bright lights of the Commons chamber. Standing at the dispatch box, Keir Starmer's ministers, their party enjoying a fragile but consistent lead in the polls, had pledged a full, statutory national inquiry into the grooming gang scandal. It was to be a moment of national reckoning, a laser-focused investigation into the specific, horrifying phenomenon that had destroyed countless lives in towns from Rotherham to Rochdale, Telford to Keighley. But behind the scenes, in the quiet, carpeted offices of Whitehall, a different calculation was being made. The problem wasn't justice, it was politics. A secret memo, codenamed Operation Watermark, and circulated among a handful of senior Home Office advisors and labor strategists, outlined the primary risk. A narrow inquiry focused on the ethnicity of the predominantly Pakistani heritage perpetrators would yield, in the memo's chillingly sterile language, politically unsanitary conclusions that would be electorally combustible. The optics, it argued, would be disastrous. Focus group data from key red wall constituencies showed Labor's lead on cultural issues was already paper-thin. Fueling a narrative centered on race and failed integration would alienate key voter demographics just 18 months out from a general election. The solution was elegant in its cynicism: dilution. The government found its justification in the landmark report by Baroness Casey. While Casey's review had been a forensic demolition of the Metropolitan Police's institutional failings, her words were now carefully repurposed. A single clause recommending a broad, holistic view of child protection to address widespread challenges was twisted into a mandate to widen the new inquiry's scope far beyond its original painful intent. Suddenly, it was not just about the organized, racially aggravated gang-based exploitation that had been the focus of public outrage for 2 decades. It was about all forms of child sexual abuse, from online grooming to familial abuse. This deliberate act of conflation created a 2-tier system of victims. On one side were the survivors of the specific gang-based exploitation the inquiry was supposedly for, their unique trauma now buried in a mountain of unrelated cases. On the other, a new, larger group of survivors whose own horrific experiences were now being cynically weaponized as a political shield. As one senior civil servant would later admit in an off-the-record briefing with The Times, the goal was to muddy the waters until no one could see the bottom. The survivors who had been invited to form an advisory panel felt this shift immediately. Their initial cautious optimism soured in the first meeting. Held in a soulless room in the Home Office, they were presented with the biographies of the proposed inquiry chairs, a former senior police officer and a former social worker, representatives of the very institutions that had systematically failed them for decades. The documents were delivered by a government courier under conditions of extreme secrecy, password protected and locked to prevent screenshots, as if they contained state secrets rather than professional histories. When the survivors were then told they had to submit their questions for the candidates a full 24 hours in advance for vetting by a Home Office official, suspicion hardened into certainty. This was not an investigation. It was a performance. It was a cover-up of a cover-up. The chaos erupted at a hastily arranged press conference in a drab Westminster hotel hosted by Nigel Farage. The 5 survivors who had withdrawn from the panel sat beside him, their quiet dignity a silent, powerful rebuke to the official process. As they began to speak, the consequences rippled outwards. Farage, a master of political theater, drew a damning comparison. He noted that the ongoing COVID-19 inquiry had at that point already cost the taxpayer £192 million. He warned that this new inquiry was being deliberately designed to follow the same path, a never-ending cycle of hearings and reports, kicking the can down the road until long after the next general election, delivering process instead of justice. The pound sterling dipped half a cent against the dollar as his words hit the newswires, a small but significant tremor of market anxiety. The public reaction was immediate and volcanic. On social media, the hashtag corrupt inquiry became the #1 trend in the United Kingdom within an hour, generating over 250,000 posts by late afternoon. More than a dozen backbench MPs from all parties, including prominent conservatives like Miriam Cates, broke ranks, tweeting their support for the withdrawn survivors and demanding the government rethink. The Daily Mail's first edition front page was already drafted, its headline screaming, "A betrayal of our children." But inside the press conference, a different, more insidious story was unfolding. The assembled journalists representing the mainstream media largely ignored the survivors' testimony. Their questions, almost in unison, focused on a single, out-of-context comment made by the Labour MP Sarah Champion, who had accused Farage of opportunism. The survivors watched, their faces a mask of disbelief and rising fury, as the media pack chased a manufactured controversy while their own decades of pain were treated as a procedural sideshow. One of them, Ellie, could not stay silent. "It's taken media decades to recognize grooming gangs that are raping our children because they're white," she interjected, her voice cutting through the room with absolute clarity. "That is also racially motivated." The applause from the audience was spontaneous and sharp. The establishment's narrative had been confronted, live on air, by its primary victim. Inside the Labour Party's headquarters at Southside, the mood was controlled panic. A crisis meeting was convened in Starmer's office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fear. The leader himself stood staring out of the window at the Thames, his hands gripping the sill so tightly his knuckles were white. Jess Phillips, the Minister for Safeguarding, was furious. In a heated phone call with Starmer's Chief of Staff, Sue Gray, her voice was reportedly sharp enough to be heard through the closed door. "They're being manipulated by Farage," she insisted, her Birmingham accent hardening. "We cannot let a handful of victims, however tragic their stories, dictate government policy. This is a political attack, Sue, and we are losing." A WhatsApp message sent from Phillips to a private group of fellow ministers titled Cabinet Comms Line was even more blunt. "They're lying. They've been turned by the far right. We hold the line." The message was screenshotted and leaked within hours. This contempt would soon spill into the open. In the House of Commons the next day, Phillips would publicly question the survivors' motives from the dispatch box, stating that while their pain was real, it was being exploited by those with a darker political agenda. The survivors watched from the public gallery, describing it later as a profound and unforgivable betrayal from the very minister meant to protect them. The government's official response was a 2-page letter, sent from Keir Starmer's office and printed on thick, cream-colored parliamentary stationery. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic empathy, full of platitudes about listening and learning, of shared goals and difficult paths. It was leaked to The Guardian 30 minutes before the survivors themselves received the email, a final, petty insult. It was received with the scorn it deserved. "We don't want a polite letter," one survivor replied in a public statement that evening. "We want accountability. We want justice. We want the truth." Tashios, the letter, intended to soothe and de-escalate, only highlighted the vast, unbridgeable chasm between the government's perception of the crisis and the reality of those who had lived it. They had offered sympathy when what was demanded was action. They had offered a managed process when what was needed was the cold, hard truth. By Friday morning, a Snap YouGov poll showed that 72% of the public, including a majority of Labour's own 2019 voters, believed the government was engaged in a cover-up. The judgment was absolute. An inquiry designed to restore faith in the system had shattered it completely. The government, in its utterly desperate attempt to control the story, had lost control of everything. They had tried to silence the survivors by burying them in process, by diluting their testimony with unrelated cases, by questioning their motives and sanity. But in doing so, they had given them a platform and a moral authority they could never have. Achieved alone, the state had tried to make them manageable and in failing had made them monumental. Ellie Williams, the survivor who had calmly declared the inquiry corrupt, now stood as a symbol of its failure and of a new defiant power. I withdrew myself because I know that I can make a change, she stated in a later interview, her words a promise, just not through that panel. I will speak and I will raise awareness and I will say what's corrupt. The government had set out to write a history of the scandal that it could live with. Instead, the survivors were now writing their own, and it was a history the government and the entire political establishment could not survive. The attempt to cover up a cover-up had failed. Now, the real reckoning was about to begin. Tomorrow, we reveal the contents of the secret Home Office memo, codenamed Operation Watermark, that designed the inquiry's failure from day one. The names, the dates, the handwritten annotations in the margins, and the damning instruction from a senior minister that simply read, "Bury it." You won't believe what they reveal.